On a Friday afternoon in late July of 2023, drivers working out of a yellow freight terminal in Nashville got a phone call nobody at the company was supposed to make. By the next morning, the same call was reaching drivers at terminals in Atlanta, Phoenix, Chicago, and Kansas City. Within 72 hours, more than 12,000 semi-trucks and 35,000 trailers had gone quiet at the same time. It was the largest trucking failure in United States history. But the strange part isn't that Yellow collapsed. Companies collapse. The strange part is how slowly it happened, in plain sight, for almost 20 years before that Friday afternoon. Oklahoma City, 1924. Two brothers named A.J. Harrell and Cleveland Harrell painted a small fleet of taxis bright yellow and called the company Yellow Cab Transit. Within a few years, they noticed that their cabs were sometimes hauling parcels and luggage between towns more profitably than passengers, so they spun the freight side off into its own operation. The trucks kept the color. For the next several decades, Yellow grew quietly across the central United States. Through the post-war boom of the 1950s, the company expanded its terminal network east and west. By the 1970s, Yellow had reached 44 states, operated more than 220 terminals, and posted an average 32% return on equity. Yellow was part of what shippers called the Big Three of American less-than-truckload freight, alongside Roadway Express out of Akron, Ohio, and Consolidated Freightways out of Menlo Park, California. These three companies built the spine of American industrial logistics. If a furniture maker in North Carolina needed to send a pallet of dining chairs to a department store in Denver, one of the Big Three handled the run. They operated with union drivers under contracts negotiated by the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. They were dominant, profitable, and they assumed they always would be. Then, in 1980, Congress passed the Motor Carrier Act and deregulated the trucking industry. New non-union carriers entered the market with lower wages, newer equipment, and no legacy pension obligations. The Big Three had a problem they couldn't price their way out of. For 2 decades after deregulation, Yellow held its ground. It survived recessions, fuel crises, the bruising 1994 Teamsters strike that hit Yellow and Roadway hard, and the slow erosion of its market share by non-union rivals. The Teamsters made concession after concession on wages and work rules to keep the unionized carriers competitive. It mostly worked. The Big Three thinned to a Big Two when Consolidated Freightways shut its doors in September of 2002 and laid off 15,000 workers in a single weekend. At the time, that was the largest trucking bankruptcy on record. For Yellow, Consolidated's collapse looked like an opportunity. With one major rival eliminated, Yellow's leadership made a bold bet. In December of 2003, Yellow acquired its last remaining unionized competitor, Roadway Corporation, for $1.05 billion. The new company became Yellow Roadway Corporation, headquartered in Overland Park, Kansas. 18 months later, in May of 2005, the company swallowed USF Corporation, another major regional carrier with a network in the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest. The vision came from then CEO Bill Zollers. The idea was scale. Combine the surviving union carriers, dominate the LTL freight market, and use that dominance to push back against the non-union competition. The company employed roughly 70,000 people. It was a Fortune 500 enterprise. The strategy looked unstoppable. But integration is hard. Yellow Roadway, which renamed itself YRC Worldwide in 2006, was now running 3 different operating brands with 3 different terminal networks, 3 different IT systems, and 3 different sets of union locals. The acquisitions also added significant debt to the balance sheet. And then the 2008 financial crisis arrived. What happened to YRC Worldwide between 2008 and 2014 should have been the end of the story. Freight volumes collapsed during the recession. Revenue fell. The integrated company carried more than $1.4 billion in debt and couldn't make payments. In 2009, YRC came within days of bankruptcy. What saved the company was something that would become a recurring theme. The Teamsters Union agreed to a 15% wage cut for its drivers and a temporary suspension of pension contributions. Bondholders agreed to a debt-for-equity swap. The federal government's Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation negotiated a complex deal to keep the multi-employer pension funds whole. By the time the dust settled, YRC's workers had given up billions of dollars in wages and benefits to keep the company alive. The pattern held for the next decade. Every 2 or 3 years, YRC would run out of cash. Each time, the Teamsters would extend their concessions. Each time, lenders would restructure the debt. Each time, the company would survive just long enough to face the same crisis again. There was a second major restructuring in 2014, and another round of pension deferrals after that. By 2019, 2 more trucking carriers, Celadon and New England Motor Freight, had filed for bankruptcy. The LTL market was consolidating around non-union carriers like Old Dominion Freight Line, Saia, and XPO Logistics, who had no legacy pension burdens and ran newer fleets out of newer terminals. Inside YRC, there were attempts to modernize. The company invested in technology, tried to unify its brands, and rebranded itself back to Yellow Corporation in 2021. It moved its headquarters from Overland Park, Kansas, to Nashville, Tennessee. None of it changed the underlying math. Yellow was carrying debt taken on in 2003 and 2005, paying it down slowly, while non-union competitors invested in equipment and routes that Yellow couldn't afford to match. Then the pandemic hit, and for the first time in 2 decades, the federal government decided to step in directly. In July of 2020, the United States Treasury Department announced that it was loaning Yellow Corporation $700 million under the CARES Act. The loan came from a fund Congress had set aside for businesses deemed critical to national security. Yellow's argument was that its trucks carried supplies to military bases under a long-standing Defense Department contract. The Treasury accepted that argument. In exchange for the loan, the federal government received a roughly 30% equity stake in the company. The decision was controversial almost immediately. A congressional oversight commission spent the next year investigating the loan and ultimately concluded that the Treasury Department had likely erred in classifying Yellow as critical to national security. Yellow's contracts with the Defense Department represented a small fraction of its overall freight volume. Other LTL carriers could have handled the work. The Commission's report didn't have the authority to claw the money back, but it did establish, on the public record, that taxpayers had been put on the hook for a loan to a company that should have probably been allowed to restructure or fail under normal bankruptcy procedures 3 years earlier. What did Yellow do with the $700 million? Much of it went to purchasing new tractors and trailers, modernizing terminals, and paying down older debt. None of it went to the union workers who had spent the previous decade taking pay cuts to keep the company alive. That detail would matter when the next crisis arrived. For about 2 years, the bailout worked. Yellow returned to profitability in 2021, posting a $197 million operating profit in 2022. The stock briefly climbed. The new tractors began rolling out of dealer lots in their distinctive yellow-orange livery. From the outside, the company looked like it had survived the worst. But internally, leadership knew the numbers were temporary. The post-pandemic freight boom was already ending, and Yellow's restructuring plan, which the company called One Yellow, was about to run into the same union contract Yellow had been bending around for 40 years. The One Yellow plan, designed under CEO Darren Hawkins, was simple in concept and difficult in practice. The 4 operating brands that had been kept separate since the acquisitions of the 2000s, YRC Freight, Reddaway, Holland, and New Penn, would finally be combined into a single carrier. A single terminal network, a single dispatching system, a single fleet. Yellow estimated it could save hundreds of millions of dollars a year if it could just consolidate its operations. The problem was that the Teamsters contract covered each operating brand as a separate entity. Combining them required amending the collective bargaining agreement. In August of 2022, Teamsters leadership approved the first phase of One Yellow in the western United States. By the company's own internal reports, the western phase worked. Freight moved earlier, redundancies dropped, customer service improved. But the second phase, which would extend the plan to the rest of the country, stalled. For 9 months, from late 2022 through the spring of 2023, Yellow management and Teamsters leadership disagreed about the terms of the consolidation. Yellow filed a federal lawsuit against the union in late June of 2023, accusing the Teamsters of bad faith negotiation. The union responded by threatening a strike. The two sides have very different accounts of those 9 months. Yellow's executives argued that union leadership, under newly elected President Sean O'Brien, was using the negotiations to punish a company they believed had been mismanaged for decades. O'Brien and the Teamsters argued that Yellow's leadership had spent 20 years extracting concessions from drivers, taking federal bailouts, and rewarding executives, while never addressing the underlying business problems. Both arguments contained truth. What ended the company wasn't the strike itself. The Teamsters had threatened a strike on Monday, July 24, 2023, then called it off after Yellow made a partial pension payment. But by then, Yellow's customers had seen the headlines. Major shippers like Walmart and Home Depot began routing freight to competitors. The non-union carriers absorbed the volume. Within a single week of the strike threat, Yellow lost roughly a third of its daily revenue. The lenders pulled back. The cash dried up. On Friday, July 28, 2023, Yellow's leadership held a final round of meetings in Nashville and concluded that the company could not survive another business day. Operations would shut down immediately. Over the weekend, dispatchers began calling drivers individually. The message was the same one some of them had been bracing for since the strike threat ended earlier that week. Park the tractor, drop the trailer, and don't return Monday. By Sunday night, the yellow-orange trucks were sitting in terminal lots from Maine to California. Some drivers were finishing runs they would never be paid for. Others were stranded mid-route, told to drop loads at customer warehouses and find their own way home. The next morning, terminal gates began to close. The official Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing came on Sunday, August 6, 2023, in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware. Roughly 30,000 workers lost their jobs, including 22,000 Teamsters members. Many of them had spent their entire working lives at Yellow or one of its predecessor companies. Some were second or third generation. The Teamsters had marked the moment a few weeks earlier with a social media post showing a tombstone bearing the words, "Yellow, 1924 to 2023. In the months after the closure, Yellow's assets were sold off in a court-supervised auction. Roughly 130 terminal properties went under the gavel in December of 2023, raising approximately $2 billion. Estes Express Lines, a non-union competitor, was the largest single buyer. The yellow-orange tractors and trailers were sold to other carriers, repainted, and put back to work. Many of them are still on the road today, carrying freight under different names. In a surprising final chapter, Yellow's estate repaid the full $700 million CARES Act loan to the United States Treasury in early 2024. The Teamsters publicly objected, arguing that workers and pension funds should have been paid first. The bankruptcy court disagreed. The taxpayers got their money back. Most of the drivers did not get the severance, the unused vacation pay, or the WARN Act notice that federal law normally requires for mass layoffs of this size. So what actually killed Yellow? It would be easy to point at the Teamsters Union and say that the 9-month negotiation in 2022 and 2023 was the final blow. The company itself made that argument in court. It would be just as easy to point at Yellow's management and say that 2 decades of debt-financed acquisitions, executive turnover, and federal bailouts had hollowed out a business that should have been allowed to fail much earlier. The union made that argument in public. Both arguments are partly correct. The harder thing to say is that Yellow was probably a company that the deregulated American freight market was never going to allow to exist past a certain point. The 1980 Motor Carrier Act made it possible for non-union competitors to underbid unionized carriers on almost every route. The Big Three model, 3 large unionized national LTL carriers covering the country, was an artifact of the regulated trucking era. Once that era ended, the model had 40 years left in it, maybe 50. The surprise isn't that Yellow ended in 2023. The surprise is that it survived as long as it did. What's left behind isn't just empty terminal lots in Nashville or yellow tractors with new paint jobs somewhere in Texas. What's left behind is a quieter question about what the American freight system actually is today and what we want it to be. The non-union carriers that absorbed Yellow's customers are efficient, modern, and well-capitalized. They also operate under wage scales, benefit packages, and work rules that earlier generations of Teamsters spent decades fighting to change. Whether that trade-off has been worth it depends on where you're standing. From the loading dock in Nashville on the morning of August 7, 2023, it didn't look worth it. From the boardroom of a competitor that absorbed Yellow's freight by the following Tuesday, it looked like a long-anticipated correction. The trucks themselves, repainted and reassigned, have no opinion on the matter.